from the overall conference theme, which highlights the issue of families in crisis, and from the panel topic, which asks us to confront the issue of patriarchy in the East European context. My particular point of departure is the question of parental authority, the father figure as a source of authority in the household, when seen from the vantage point of their sons and daughters, within an overall destabilization of home life during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Naturally, this begs the question of cross-disciplinary perspectives, at the very least involving some input from social psychology. However, for the moment, let's focus on the historical dimension of what I'm describing as destabilization, a subject that is familiar to scholars of that period. The different aspects of this destabilization can be broken down into large subcategories. A, the economic changes that occurred in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century and in consequence also influenced the Jewish social fabric. Such changes included urbanization, underemployment and pauperization, the emergence of a more fortunate entrepreneurial class, and of course, large-scale migration to the West. And as well, this includes the cultural changes that affected many parts of East European society, to which Jews were by no means immune, and perhaps might be considered prime examples of people in the throes of broad cultural change. And I include here matters of language shift, education, reading habits, religion, and political culture. What I propose, therefore, in dialogue with my fellow panelists, is to ask how these changes became manifest in ways that affected patriarchy and its fate. Indeed, as I see it, I think more or less in agreement with Shaul on this point, contributed to its weakening. I do so in this context not so much with gender relations in mind, but mainly in reference to paternal relations with the younger generation. I will argue that the persistence over time that's implicit in the generic, abstract model of patriarchy does not cohere very well with the significant challenges to parental influence and authority that arose in Jewish homes in response to the unstable social conditions of the time. Now, this obviously has some bearing, if only by implication, on the question of gender hierarchies as well, since paternal authority was perceptibly weaker among Jews, and this is borne out at least in the American immigrant context, which in some indirect way might or might not reflect back on Eastern Europe, something to be perhaps raised in discussion. But in the American Jewish immigrant context, for example, Jews compared with members of other cultural groups had a much less robust patriarchal family setup. And so overall, I would say that this loosening of roles, and certainly for fathers, reflected a loosened intergenerational hierarchy, but also, in fact, a modified approach to social roles in general. And this is not a brand new argument by any means. The terrain is familiar enough to any of you who might be fans of the stories of Tevye the Dairyman, insofar as literary representation can be included with other forms of social commentary, memoir, and documentation. It's in the interest of fleshing out that last bit, mining first-person narratives for added testimony about destabilized households and grassroots challenges to patriarchal models of parental authority, that I offer a few examples here. Now, many of you will be familiar already with a couple of the classic texts, such as Mary Anton's The Promised Land, which involves a very clear undermining of the authority and the persona of the father, who is a bit of a lo yutzlach, and in the end manages to go off to America to try and find his fortune, leaving his wife and children back in Russia for a while until they managed to come over afterwards. And I won't go into it in much length here because I have other points I'd like to make, but we can go back in the discussion if you like. Other classic texts that are well known, Rose Cohen's Out of the Shadow. Both of these texts are written by young women, both reflections on the fragility of the Jewish family, poised to emigrate or in the aftermath of emigration. There's also the somewhat less known a Hebrew text, Eile Toldot Adam by Ephraim Lisitsky, the Hebrew educator who lived in New Orleans for many years, who also experienced this kind of rupture. His father was widowed when Ephraim was rather young. He then remarried. There are new children born, and as soon as the children are born, the father goes off to America and is there for 7 years, while it is indeed the stepmother who is running the household, and Ephraim grows up under her aegis, under her wing. And then they rejoin the fathers in Boston after 7 years' absence, and there's a great fracture running through the heart of this complex household. I want to consider with you 2 unpublished memoirs, one of which I have written briefly about in the past, and the other one has not ever been published. One was written in Hebrew by a Hebrew educator from Canada, originally from Poland, by the name of Yeshaya Heschel Pearlstone, or Harris Pearlstone, as he became known in Canada. And he describes at length, the memoir was written at a fairly young age. He was a young adult, and in old age, he encountered the manuscript, his own memoir, written back in the day when he was in his 20s. He encountered it again when he was in his 70s, did a bit of shiputz to the text, and gave it to his children. They didn't understand Hebrew, so they gave it to me to translate. At any rate, Heschel Pearlstone grew up in a very traditional environment, but very quickly found his feet as a maskil among the other yeshiva boys clustered in the Beit Midrash, and becomes, in fact, adept at German and Russian language, and in the end turns his talents to becoming a private tutor of Russian language in the town. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's at this point where the culture of this youngster who is spreading his wings and challenging the norms of his household, his father, and his surroundings, it becomes critical for the young man to assert his autonomy. And in the brief quote that I'll use here, when his father takes him to task for the way he's been behaving and the path that he's been taking. But father, I argued, in the first place, I did not go ahead with this on my own. I asked my brother's advice. In the second place, he had an older brother who had already moved to the big city and was a man of the world, a man of business. In the second place, are you able to provide me the clothes I need so that I needn't be ashamed to show myself in public? In the third place, he had a lot of good points. In a year or two, I'll be called up for military service, and it will be necessary to bribe the doctors and the officials. Can you afford that? And this, of course, was the straw that broke the camel's back, because the question here of the father's authority not extending further than his purse strings becomes the crucial point. There is no way for the father to exert parental control once this issue of the family poverty intrudes in a very, very direct manner up until the point where the question of military conscription becomes the lever that the son is using against the authority of his father. If you will, the Oedipal conflict comes out in the dress of a Russian soldier. Of course, Pearlstone didn't serve but emigrated. On the other hand, my grandfather did serve, because not only was his family incredibly poor, but he didn't have... my grandfather, on my mother's side, did serve in the Russian army. Wrote his memoirs at a very late age. He was in his 70s already and living in New York since the 1920s. He wrote his memoirs in Yiddish. And I'll very, very briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time, But I will come back to Pearlstone at the end if I have a few minutes. My grandfather lived with his paternal grandfather as a young child. The reason being that his own parents didn't have enough money to support the children in the household. There were 5 children at that point in the household. His parents couldn't afford to feed, clothe, or house all of them at once. So my grandfather was housed with his grandfather. His grandfather was the town shoichet, a stalwart and very respected member of the Gerer Stiebel in the town by the name of Jove in the southwestern part of Poland. And he grew up at his grandfather's table. His grandfather ran a 4:30 a.m. Talmud shir every day, and so it was quite what one might expect from a Hasidic household in southwest Poland in the mid-1890s. Nevertheless, as it becomes clear in the course of the memoir, it is the peer group at the Beis Medrash, once again, where my grandfather began to glimpse a different order of things in a different world. These were the young hoodlums of the town who took it upon themselves in the running up period to the 1905 revolution to gather pistols and hide them in the woodshed and that sort of thing. They did things that they shouldn't do, and they weren't very much ashamed of it. In fact, it's at this point where my grandfather also begins to play the role as a breadwinner in his own parents' household. Again, he's not living under his parents' roof, but his parents are so incredibly, desperately poor. His father, my great-grandfather, was a proto-maskil of sorts. We recall a Hasidic family, a shoichet. His son is a Hebraist who ran off to Warsaw to try and get himself into the good graces of the publishers of the Hebrew journals of the time. And it didn't work. He wasn't accepted among the chevre of the maskilim in Warsaw. He came back to his own town and turned himself into a kind of a news agent who would distribute the Hebrew and Yiddish newspapers to the surrounding families, and, as you might expect, a tutor of Hebrew language in the houses of the well-to-do members of the families of the town. There were several well-to-do families. They weren't all dirt poor. And that was how he tried to eke out a living. My grandfather, at the ripe age of about 14, began to act as his father's business partner and tried to expand the newspaper subscription business, not only within the town, but beyond its limits. And this became his way to establish himself on a par with his father as a kind of a friend and partner. The father was less a father than an older friend. They had a very, a more or less equalized social footing between the two of them. The two older boys in the family, my grandfather and his older brother, were apprenticed out during their teens in different towns and left the town to work. My grandfather ended up working in a textile import-export firm in Łódź and was absent from the home for several years, up until the time when he faced military conscription. There was no money to bribe the doctors. My grandfather was recruited to the Russian army, served for 3 years. Unfortunately for him, when his 3 years were up and he was about to be demobilized, the First World War broke out, and he went off to fight. In the first week of the war, he fell into German captivity in the Battle of Tannenberg. I'll make this a long story short. The point of this long tale, and it's not finished, but the point is that at no point in this entire situation that's being described, at no point can we observe an actual operational patriarchy. The grandfather has no actual control or social influence or disciplinary influence over his own son, who has changed his way of life quite drastically. The father, the middle generation, similarly has more or less abdicated his parental role due to the dire economic circumstances. And the question here is of this three-generational series or progression of young men who are rejecting any sense of parental authority vis-a-vis their father. And I would note here in passing that there's some vague structural analogy between the Pearlstone case and my grandfather's case, in which there is the sense in which one takes one's fate into one's hand at a fairly young age, certainly economically, as well as some sort of personal responsibility. The question also is of the way in which these young adolescent young men are using new knowledge as a wedge to try and shape their own way of life. Pearlstone uses the knowledge of languages in order to, languages that go beyond the ken of his parental home, in order to supply himself with some wherewithal, with some entree to the middle-class houses in his town, in Lomja. My grandfather also involves himself in this trade in periodicals and newspapers, and in fact is quite an entrepreneur, making sure that there are train stations along the way where he can go. He goes to Warsaw to discuss with the publishers of the newspapers how he can get copies of the newspaper before anyone else so that he can have an edge on the distribution, and so on. So these are new skills that the older generation simply has no idea how to wield, and he uses them, as I say, as a kind of a wedge. I would add from the same material another case in the same extended family where my grandfather's uncle by marriage, a very pious man but fairly well-to-do, as he was the manager of the local electricity plant. He runs a fairly strictly traditional household, but his wife, my grandfather's aunt, who was very close to him in age, about 6 years apart, my grandfather's aunt responded to my grandfather's suggestion that she bring into the household a tutor for the younger children who would be able to tutor them in Polish and arithmetic and other general subjects. And it was his aunt who persuaded her husband that this was the thing that must be done in order to provide some sort of a better future for their children. And again, here it's not a question of dire economic necessity at all. The household is well off. And yet here we see once this erosion, if you will, or weakening of the strict separation of parental roles is in place, it is in fact fairly simple for leverage to be practiced, to be put into effect by the wife. I have only about a minute and a half, so let me end with one comment about methodology, and then maybe one last quote from Pearlstone. Clearly, these are anecdotal bits of evidence. They don't cover the ground. They don't stand in for the great mass of the statistical mass of East European Jewish society, and I don't pretend that they do. What I do suggest is that such individual recollections, these first-person narratives, can be used bit by bit as increments to a wider fund of knowledge that we do have. I think that when we put the pieces together with other pieces of information, and I mentioned earlier the question of how does this play once you get these Jewish family members across the ocean, how come they turn out to be much less invested in the patriarchal setup than their neighbors who are Italians or Poles or Germans or members of other cultures? How is it that that happens? This is a question. And I won't answer it now. We can take it up later if you like. And finally, one last, I said a quote from Pearlstone. Pearlstone in 1946 prepared his will. And in his will, he included the sort of ethical will type comments that are fairly traditional for intelligent, learned Jews. And he had an interesting thing to say about intergenerational communication and parental authority and parental influence. And his take on it was interesting in the sense that he felt that it was possible to recover a better relationship between fathers and their children than was the case in his own case, or in fact his relationship to his own children. He said, among other things in this will, he said, I did not give you as good a Jewish education as I could have wished for. And this is a man who was a Jewish educator in Montreal. This was due to my poverty and economic distress, my running around all day to give lessons so as to earn enough to buy bread for my family. The result was that I saw you only from one Saturday to another. I had to devote my whole energy to the task of making a living, so much so that I had very little energy left to struggle with you. The gulf between me and you was too great, and I found it impossible to bridge it with my feeble strength. I was deeply rooted in Lomje, while you, on the other hand, threw yourselves with all the heat and energy of your young blood into the American way of life, and looked upon each Jewish teacher as superfluous. All my efforts were of no avail. With you, however, the situation is altogether different. No gulf exists between you and your children. You speak the same language and receive the same education. Also, the burden of making a living does not fall so heavily upon you as upon your father. You understand your children, and your children understand you. You are in a position to exercise the greatest influence over them. And so on and so on. Time is up, I see, so I'm going, in fact, a little bit over. So I'm going to stop here, and your questions I'll welcome in the comment period. Thank you.